My name is Eva, and I'm 34 years old. I spent most of my life being the dependable one, the one who stayed home when everyone else left, the one who cleaned up quietly after other people's chaos. I never thought I was invisible. Not really, until the day my parents passed, and I realized they had built a legacy that didn't include me. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. Lucas was always the star. Even when we were little, the way my parents looked at him, it was different. Like he carried all their hopes. He had charm, jokes, wild plans. He was messy, impulsive, always chasing something, but they loved him for it. Me? I was the background. I learned early on that being helpful got me more affection than asking for things. So I helped. I stayed quiet. I got good grades. I did chores without reminders. I filled the space he left behind. He came home with bad grades. They said school didn't suit his creative mind. I came home with straight A's. They said, "That's just Eva." Lucas crashed Dad's car at 17. They called it a learning experience. When I forgot to call on their anniversary once, Mom didn't speak to me for days. The house we grew up in became my cage. Not because they forced me to stay, but because I thought staying would earn me something. When Mom got sick, it was obvious who would step up. Lucas lived across the country and had big projects. He sent flowers. I drove her to every appointment. I tracked her medications. I sat beside her through every lab result, every silence in the room that lasted just a little too long. When Dad began forgetting the days of the week, I organized sticky notes, color-coded the kitchen, made laminated cards with our names and faces. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't complain, because I hoped that if I held their world together, eventually someone would hold mine. Lucas would show up once every few months, just long enough for photos, just long enough to be called amazing for being there at all. He'd arrive with a new jacket, a story about some client or adventure, and they'd light up like he'd just returned from war. They never asked me how I was. They assumed I was fine. I was always fine. That's what made me dependable. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I disappeared, just for a weekend. Would anyone notice? Would anyone check the pill organizer I updated daily? Would someone miss the meals I prepped or the bills I paid? But I never left, not even when I wanted to scream. Because good daughters don't leave, they endure. I thought that one day, when the noise settled, I'd be seen. That maybe, when the house was quiet and the chaos was over, I'd finally matter. That I'd be more than just the one who stayed. But then came the phone call. It was late, just past midnight. I was folding Dad's sweaters, organizing the winter ones into plastic bins. When I picked up, the voice on the other end wasn't familiar, just clinical. Cold. The words hit in a strange order. Passed peacefully. Your mother. Shortly after. I didn't cry. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream. I just stopped. It was as if my body already knew, like some part of me had been waiting for this moment, not out of dread, but exhaustion. There was nothing more to hold together. They were both gone. The next few days were a blur of logistics, phone calls, forms, small decisions that felt far too big. Lucas didn't come for the arrangements. He sent a message. "Thanks for taking care of everything, Ev. I'll be there for the will." That was the moment I felt something crack. Not from grief, from clarity. Because for the first time, I wasn't grieving what I had lost. I was grieving the realization that maybe I had never really had it. The funeral was small. Neighbors, a few family friends. They all said the same things. You were such a blessing to your parents. They were lucky to have you. You always took such good care of them. And yet not one of them asked how I was holding up. Not one of them wondered why Lucas wasn't standing beside me. When the lawyer called about the will, I didn't expect anything grand. My parents weren't wealthy, but the house was paid off. The savings were modest, and I thought, Surely, at the very least, I would be left with the place I had held together. But that's not how the story ended. I sat in the lawyer's office, hands folded in my lap, watching as he opened the envelope. His eyes softened when he looked at me. That's when I knew. The house, the savings, the heirlooms, all of it, left to Lucas, to me, a bracelet, one I didn't recognize, a silver chain with 4 words engraved on the inside. Our little helper. No explanation, no letter, no mention of my years, my sacrifices, my presence. Just that phrase. I stared at it in the car for a long time, let the weight of it settle into my palms. Not the bracelet, the message, the final quiet reminder that I had always been useful, but never essential. They hadn't left me behind in death. They had done it piece by piece every day of their lives. And I had let them. I don't know why I wore it. Maybe part of me needed to believe it meant something more than it did. Maybe I wanted to rewrite the story in my head, give it some poetic meaning. Or maybe I just didn't know what else to do with a legacy that fit into a velvet pouch the size of my palm. The bracelet hung loosely around my wrist as I returned to the empty house. Every creak in the floor, every whisper in the pipes, it all sounded louder now, as if the silence had been waiting for me to be alone before it settled in. The funeral had been days ago. The condolences had stopped. The casserole dishes were gone. Lucas hadn't even called to check how it went. He sent a text with a thumbs-up emoji and a "thanks again for handling everything." I read it 3 times, deleted it, then retyped "you're welcome," and deleted that too. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was suspended in something softer, something that looked like calm but felt like erasure. I wore it to the lawyer's office the next morning. Not for Lucas, who finally decided to show up, but for myself. As armor, maybe. He arrived late, of course, smelling like expensive cologne and airport lounges. He greeted me with that wide grin he always wore when he knew he was getting away with something. "You look tired," he said with fake concern. "You look rich," I replied, keeping my voice flat. He laughed. I didn't. Mr. Harris gave us the official reading, though we already knew the contents. Lucas acted surprised, like it hadn't been expected. Like the house, the accounts, and the remaining valuables were some emotional burden rather than a reward he never earned. He didn't ask what I'd been left. I didn't tell him. But I caught him glancing at the bracelet as we stood to leave. I saw something shift in his expression for a split second. Not guilt, Lucas never carried that, but curiosity. Like he couldn't quite remember where it came from, either. The ride home was quiet. I stopped halfway and sat in a park, letting the wind move around me like it could blow away the ache. A child ran past me chasing bubbles, her laughter echoing off the trees. And I remembered, briefly, a time when I used to laugh like that. Before everything became duty. Before every moment felt like a checklist. That evening, I found an old photo album buried in the hall closet, thick with dust, cracked leather binding. I flipped through it on the living room floor, hoping to find something, anything, of me. Page after page, Lucas's first steps. Lucas at the beach. Lucas in his school uniform, face covered in chocolate, grinning like he owned the world. Me? I was there, occasionally, usually in the background, holding something, fixing something, clapping for someone else. I found one picture where I was front and center. I was maybe 10 years old, wearing a handmade costume for a school play. My arms were open wide on stage, my eyes were bright, and there, in the corner, my parents were clapping, sort of, smiling, kind of. But their eyes weren't on me. They were looking at Lucas in the audience, who was pretending to film with a toy camera, stealing the attention even then. And around my wrist in that photo, nothing. The bracelet wasn't there. I leaned closer, scanning every detail, every blur of color. It wasn't mine then. So where had it come from? I closed the album, sat there for a long time. The house was still. the sun had set, and I realized something I hadn't let myself feel until that moment. I didn't know who I was without them. Not really. Because my entire identity had been shaped around what they needed from me, what they didn't give me, what I thought I had to earn. Every decision I made was in reaction to their absence, their silence, their misplaced admiration. And now that they were gone, truly gone, I didn't have anyone to prove myself to, or hide from. I looked down at the bracelet again. The words inside were no longer sharp. They felt faded, small, like something from someone else's story. And for the first time in my life, I took it off. Not in anger, not in sadness, in quiet, deliberate release. I placed it on the kitchen table, walked outside barefoot, let the wind hit my face. The sky was a soft gradient of fading blue and deep purple, and the air tasted like early spring. I didn't know what came next, but for once, that felt okay. The bracelet was starting to irritate my skin. I didn't even remember them ever mentioning it. The engraving inside, our little helper, was neat, impersonal. It felt more like a trophy for good behavior than a gift from people who knew me. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. Not out of vanity, just curiosity. I looked at my own face like I was meeting someone for the first time. The woman in the reflection looked older than I remembered. Tired, yes, but also composed. She didn't look like someone who had been discarded. She looked like someone who had survived something no one ever acknowledged. In the back of my mind, I kept waiting for a memory to surface. Something to explain the bracelet. A Christmas morning, a birthday, a hospital visit where it had been handed to me with meaning. But there was nothing. No context. Just the dull, metallic truth that after all these years, this was all they thought I needed. The house felt different without the bracelet. Not physically, of course. The floors still creaked the same way when I walked down the hallway. The radiator still hummed when the air dipped at night. But there was a subtle shift, like I had left something behind on that kitchen table, something heavier than silver. For the first time in weeks, I didn't start my morning with a list. No pills to sort, no appointments to track, no hushed arguments with insurance representatives about coverage or codes. The silence wasn't freedom yet, but it was a beginning. I wandered into the attic without thinking. It had been years since I'd gone up there. The stairs were narrow and uneven, the air thick with dust and insulation. I had only ever climbed them to store seasonal decorations or forgotten appliances. I never imagined there would be anything personal waiting. Stacks of them, yellowed at the edges, each one tied with thin ribbons that had faded into soft pinks and blues. Most were addressed to my mother, some from her sister, a few from her college roommate. But one stack had my name on them. Eva, written in my mother's handwriting. I sat down cross-legged on the attic floor, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. There were 12 letters in total, each dated in a different year. Some from my teenage years, one from the year I left for college, another from just 3 months before she passed. Why had she never given them to me? I opened the first, hands trembling slightly. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs written in neat cursive. She talked about how quiet I was as a child, how she'd watch me organize my books by color, how she wished she could understand the world I seemed to live in, so focused, so different from Lucas, who lived in constant motion. She said she admired my steadiness, that she wasn't always sure how to show it. I read the second, then the third. Each letter was a small window. Not into her affection, she rarely said I love you, but into her awareness. She saw things, moments I had long forgotten, times I had cried softly in the bathroom, days I had packed lunches for everyone while pretending it was no big deal, even times when I pushed her wheelchair outside so she could feel the sun, even though she never asked. She had noticed. She just hadn't known how to say it. The 10th letter broke me. It was written after one of Lucas's visits. She wrote about how she feared she had created a narrative in which he was the bright one and I was the strong one, but that it wasn't fair. That she'd leaned too hard on my silence, that she had mistaken my composure for invincibility. I gave Lucas all the encouragement, she wrote, but I gave you all the weight. And that wasn't love, it was convenience. I sat there in the dust, knees pulled to my chest, letter trembling in my hands, and I cried. Not for what I'd lost, but for what I had almost never known. Not validation, but truth. In her own flawed way, my mother had tried. She hadn't erased me. She just didn't know how to reach me while she was busy protecting the story she had told herself about her children. Lucas was the dream. I was the net beneath it. And while she had praised him aloud, she had written to me in secret. I wiped my face and carefully stacked the letters back inside the chest. I wasn't ready for the last two yet. There was something sacred about the pacing, like each one needed time to breathe before the next could be understood. I stood and looked around the attic again. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't, because now there was a new truth in this house, one that didn't erase the pain, but reframed it. I hadn't been invisible. I had just been misread. Downstairs, the bracelet still sat on the table. I looked at it differently now. Our little helper? Maybe it hadn't been meant to belittle me. Maybe it was the only language she knew for someone who had quietly saved their family 100 times over. But it still wasn't enough, because no engraved phrase could carry the full weight of what had been placed on me, and now I didn't need it to. That night, I placed the letters in a small wooden box of my own. I wrapped them in fabric, sealed it gently, and placed it inside the drawer beside my bed. Not to forget them, but to protect them, because they were finally mine, not borrowed approval, not inherited guilt. Just a voice, her voice, meeting mine across time, for the first time without judgment. And somehow, in the quiet of that attic, in the stillness of that moment, I felt more real than I ever had before. But that day, something pulled me there. Not a sound, not a scent, just a quiet urge. Like the attic itself had remembered I was still here, still holding questions no one had answered. It was dim, lit only by the dusty window at the far end. I moved boxes, stepped over old furniture, sidestepped a broken lamp with a shade that had caved in. And then I saw it. A small cedar chest, tucked behind a rusted baby stroller and a plastic bin filled with tangled Christmas lights. It didn't look special, the kind of box that might hold tablecloths or broken ornaments, but something about the way it was placed, deliberately hidden, not carelessly tossed, made me pause. It wasn't locked. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. Old paper, dried perfume, the scent of something untouched for decades. Inside were envelopes, letters. I hadn't spoken to Lucas since the will reading. We didn't fight. There was no dramatic blowout or angry exchange. Just the usual silence that stretched between us like a bridge that had collapsed long ago. He got what he came for. I got what I didn't know I was holding. But 4 days later, he showed up. No warning, no message, just the sound of a car pulling into the driveway and footsteps on the porch. I looked through the window and saw him standing there, holding 2 coffee cups like this was just a casual check-in between siblings. He smiled when I opened the door, like nothing had happened. I was in the area, he said. I stepped aside and let him in, more out of habit than warmth. He sat in Dad's old recliner like he owned it, like he had always belonged here, like he hadn't spent the last 10 years calling this place a burden. He looked around. You've kept it the same. I said nothing, because what I wanted to say was that responsible was just another word for used. That being the one who never left didn't mean I was loved more. It just meant I was expected to hold up everything they didn't want to face. He looked around again, his gaze lingering on a photo of our parents on the bookshelf. It feels weird without them. I nodded. But what I thought was, it feels lighter. Not because I didn't miss them, but because the constant pressure to be invisible had finally lifted. Lucas stood and walked toward the hallway. I'm going to check the old room. I didn't stop him. Let him see what remained. Let him touch the dusty trophies they never boxed up. Let him stand in front of the mirror he used to pose in as a teenager, practicing smiles he would later wear in boardrooms and weddings I wasn't invited to. While he wandered, I sat at the kitchen table, fingers resting where the bracelet had once been. I thought about the letters upstairs, about the box in the attic, about how many things we inherit that no one ever names out loud. When he returned, he looked unsettled. It's smaller than I remember. I nodded again. Everything is. He didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets. I didn't mean for it to be like this, Ava. I looked at him. He wasn't apologizing. He was just trying to make sure he wasn't the villain in a story he didn't write. I didn't ask for any of it, he said. They just gave it to me. I almost laughed. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? They did just give it to him. Their attention, their forgiveness, their legacy. And when I held it all together, when I managed the chaos and wiped their tears and caught the things that fell through the cracks, I wasn't rewarded. I was simply expected. I stood up slowly and walked to the sink, poured the rest of the coffee down the drain. It was cold anyway. You don't have to justify anything to me, Lucas, I said. He looked surprised, maybe because I wasn't crying, maybe because I wasn't demanding fairness. But I had already made peace with what I didn't receive. I wasn't here to beg for recognition anymore. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm selling the house, he said. I froze. It's mine, legally, and I don't want to keep it. Too many memories. You understand, right? The words hit harder than I expected. Not because I didn't see it coming, but because deep down I'd let myself believe I still had time. Time to say goodbye to each room, to leave on my own terms, to stand in the space that raised me and exhale the version of myself it had built. You'll have 30 days to move out, he added, almost softly. I nodded. He walked to the door and paused. I'll send the papers tomorrow. Let me know if you need help. I didn't answer. And then he was gone. Just like that. No farewell, no final words, no thank you for everything I'd done. Just footsteps fading into the distance, a car door slamming, and the quiet hum of a future I hadn't chosen, but would now have to step into. I sat back down. This house had never really been mine, but I had filled it with my breath, my patience, my resilience. It had been my battlefield and my prison, and maybe my sanctuary too. Now I had 30 days, not to mourn, but to let go. One room at a time. Because yes, I had kept everything the same, but not for the reasons he assumed. Not out of nostalgia, not out of love, but because when your entire existence is structured around someone else's comfort, you don't learn how to make changes for yourself. He handed me the coffee, and we sat there in awkward silence, the kind that pretends to be peace, but is really just avoidance dressed up as calm. I found the bracelet, I said finally. He blinked. What bracelet? I held out my wrist. Empty now, but he seemed to recognize the weight of it anyway. Oh, that old thing. Didn't Mom give you that when we were kids? She didn't. It was in the will. He raised his eyebrows like it was news to him, but something flickered in his eyes. A twitch of memory, maybe. Or guilt. Or neither. I guess they always thought of you as the responsible one, he said, sipping his coffee like the words meant nothing. I let the silence answer for me. 30 days. It sounded generous when he said it, like a gift instead of an expiration date. But once the front door closed behind him, the clock started ticking in my chest, louder than the wind outside or the creaks in the floorboards. 30 days to pack up a lifetime. 30 days to erase myself from the place where I had waited to be seen. The first day, I did nothing. I wandered from room to room, touching doorknobs, tracing the edges of framed photos, standing in doorways like a stranger who had broken in and didn't know what to steal. I didn't cry. I didn't pack. I just stood inside the echoes. The second day, I opened a cabinet and found 4 chipped teacups no one had used in years. I wrapped them in newspaper and placed them gently in a box labeled Donate. I didn't want them. I didn't need them. But I also couldn't bring myself to throw them away. By the end of the week, I had packed 3 boxes. Each one held more than objects. They held choices of what to remember and what to let go. A drawer full of receipts went straight into the trash. So did an old grocery list with my handwriting on it, where I had scribbled, "Lucas likes this one," beside a brand of cereal. I stared at that note longer than I should have, then tore it in half. The attic stayed locked. I wasn't ready for that again. Not yet. Instead, I focused on the living room. I cleaned the shelves that had collected years of dust and obligation. I found a birthday card I had written to my mother 5 years ago, still sealed, tucked behind an old clock. I had bought it, signed it, but never gave it to her. The message inside was simple. "Thank you for trying. I'm trying too." I kept that one. Some nights I fell asleep on the couch, too tired to climb the stairs. I left the kitchen light on like I used to when they were alive, just in case someone needed to find their way. Old habits died louder than people. The neighbors started noticing the change. Mrs. Langley from across the street dropped off banana bread and didn't ask why the curtains were open. Mr. Jensen from next door offered to help with boxes, assuming I was moving somewhere closer to the city. I nodded and smiled and let them believe this was part of a plan. But there was no plan. Just 30 days. Each one peeled away another layer of who I had been here. The version of me that carried pills in her purse, that kept the calendar updated with doctor's appointments, that learned to speak softly so as not to stir old wounds, that waited for affection like it was something to be earned. On day 12, I opened the photo albums again. This time, I didn't search for myself. I searched for them, not to punish, not to compare, but to understand. There was one photo of my father I hadn't remembered. He was younger, seated at a park bench, feeding a bird from his hand. His smile was genuine, relaxed. I wondered who took the photo, and why that version of him rarely visited the house we shared. There were no captions, no dates, just frozen moments that refused to explain themselves. Day 17 brought rain, the soft, constant kind that made the windows sweat and the ceiling leak near the back bedroom. I placed a bowl under the drip and sat beside it, listening. I thought about all the times I had patched that roof, quietly, without thanks. Lucas never even knew it leaked. On day 20, I opened the envelope from the lawyer that had arrived the week before. Inside was the official deed, signed, transferred, confirming that the house no longer belonged to me, that soon it wouldn't belong to anyone who remembered how the radiator clicked before sunrise or how the back steps froze first in winter. I placed it in the box marked "Final" and moved on. I didn't call Lucas, not once. I didn't update my friends, those few I had left after years of fading into this house. I didn't post about the change. I didn't announce it to the world. This ending was private, sacred, a shedding. Day 24, I found a list my mother had written. Things to fix before winter. My name was beside every task. The pipes, the pantry door, the loose tile in the bathroom. She hadn't even signed it Eva, just assumed I would know. I burned that list in the fireplace, watched the ink curl and disappear. Day 28, I walked through the house barefoot, like I had as a child. I let the cold wood meet my skin and the silence fill the spaces between my steps. I stood in each doorway and said nothing. I didn't need to. The walls knew me, and I was learning to know myself without them. On the final day, I packed the last box at dawn. I left the curtains open, the keys on the counter, the letters in my suitcase, and the bracelet, still sitting where I had left it weeks ago. I finally placed it in a small drawer in the hallway and closed it gently. Not forgotten, just finished. I locked the door behind me, turned the key, and for the first time in years, I stepped off the porch without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wouldn't be carrying this house with me anymore. The apartment wasn't much. One bedroom, a tiny balcony, a kitchen so narrow I had to turn sideways to open the fridge. But it was mine. Not inherited, not assigned, not temporary. I had signed the lease myself, picked the paint for the walls, bought the secondhand sofa that creaked every time I sat down. It was the first time I had chosen anything without considering someone else's needs first. The first night, I didn't sleep well. It wasn't the noise. There wasn't much of that, just the occasional shuffle from the neighbor upstairs or a dog barking distantly through the open window. No, it was the quiet, the kind that wasn't heavy or urgent, the kind that didn't ask me to listen for coughs or monitor the oxygen machine or brace for a knock on my bedroom door at 2 a.m. It was just quiet, and I didn't know what to do with it. I laughed to myself when I dropped a plate and it shattered on the tile, not because I enjoyed the mess, but because no one was there to be disappointed. For the first time in my life, my mistakes belonged only to me. The letters stayed in a box beside my bed. I hadn't reread them since leaving the house, but I kept them close, not out of pain, but because they were proof that my silence had always had weight, even when no one said so. I began writing in a notebook, not a journal. I didn't document my days. I just wrote pieces of thoughts, lines that came to me while washing dishes or waiting for the kettle to boil. Memories, fragments, things I had wanted to say to my mother but never did. Sometimes I wrote to myself as if I were still a child. Other times, I wrote to the version of me who stayed too long in that house. And once, I wrote to Lucas. I never mailed it. But the act of writing it was enough. It was a letter that didn't ask him to change or apologize. It simply said, "I know why you left." But I stayed, and both of those things mattered. One afternoon, I walked through the city and noticed a community center offering free weekend workshops: writing, painting, cooking, even ceramics. I took a flyer and tucked it into my bag. It sat there for a week before I signed up. I chose the writing class, not because I wanted to be a writer, but because I wanted to know what my voice sounded like when I wasn't editing myself. The first session, we were asked to write about a room from our childhood. Most people chose their bedrooms. I wrote about the hallway, the long, narrow stretch of wood where I had listened to my parents argue behind closed doors, where I had sat cross-legged as a child, waiting for someone to come out and say it was over. I read it aloud. My voice shook. No one interrupted. No one dismissed it. After class, a woman named Claire tapped my shoulder and said, "You write like someone who's survived something." I nodded, because I had. Not something dramatic or loud, but something slow and invisible. I had survived being overlooked, and now I was learning to be seen. Week by week, my apartment began to feel like a home, not a museum to someone else's memory, not a cage built from expectations, just a space filled with the things I had chosen, a lamp with a warm glow, a mug that fit perfectly in my hand, a mirror that didn't hang too high on the wall. I even bought a small plant. It died in 10 days, but I bought another, and this time, it lived. That felt like enough. I didn't call Lucas. He didn't call me. That part of the story had ended quietly, and I was content to let it stay that way. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed anything from him. One morning, while reorganizing a drawer, I found the bracelet. I must have packed it without meaning to, tucked it between clothes or old receipts. I held it in my palm, turned it over, read the words again. Our little helper. It still hurt, but less. I didn't throw it away. I didn't wear it either. Instead, I placed it in a glass jar and set it on a shelf, not as a symbol of who I had been, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. I wasn't her anymore. I wasn't just someone's helper, someone's backup plan, someone's emotional storage unit. I was a woman learning to choose her own life, not loud, not fast, but fully. And in this small apartment, with the peeling paint and creaky floor and the light that hit just right on Sunday mornings, I had finally found the place I chose. Not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. The next morning, I made coffee and drank it sitting on the balcony. It overlooked a narrow alley and a few backyards filled with laundry lines and rusted bikes. Nothing picturesque, but the light hit the bricks just right, and I let the sun warm my face without guilt. I had never learned how to be still without being on alert, so I practiced, 1 hour at a time. I bought myself a small bookshelf, slowly filled it with paperbacks from a nearby thrift store. Some were books I remembered loving, others I had never had time for. I ran my fingers along their spines and felt something rebuild inside me. Not identity exactly, but the freedom to explore one. I hung art on the walls. Nothing fancy. Prints of abstract colors, a map of the stars, a photograph of a woman walking through tall grass alone, looking over her shoulder like she was on the verge of remembering something important. I cooked meals without anyone watching. I burned a few. I had almost forgotten the box. It sat quietly in the back of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of folded blankets and an empty suitcase. I had placed it there on move-in day without much thought, just one of many things I carried forward from a life I no longer lived. But one quiet afternoon, while changing the linens and airing out the room, I saw the corner of it again. Dusty, undisturbed, the letters. I didn't open them right away. Instead, I carried the box to the kitchen table, where the late light filtered through the blinds in warm golden stripes. I made tea, sat down, let my fingers hover over the worn cardboard lid like it might burn me. These weren't love letters. They weren't sweet memories or expressions of warmth. They were the thoughts I had never spoken aloud, words written in silence, in late hours, in rooms where no one saw me, each one sealed and addressed, but never mailed. They weren't for the people named on the envelopes. Not really. They were for me. You're still here. I don't know how. Some days you're all backbone and no breath, but you keep showing up. I'm proud of you, even when no one else is. I reread that one, twice. It felt like a whisper from a version of me I had almost lost. I opened more. A letter to a teacher who once told me I had a gift for stories. One to a boy I liked when I was 16 who never noticed me. One to the mirror I avoided for a year after my mother's illness consumed the house. Some were angry. Some were tired. Some were gentle. All of them were honest, and none of them had ever been sent. That had always been my way. Quiet truths, carefully contained. I never wanted to burden anyone, never wanted to create conflict. So I learned to bleed internally, through ink, not voice, through paper, not confrontation. But now, in this small apartment that echoed only with my footsteps, I wondered if I had been too good at swallowing my voice. I gathered the letters and placed them in a new box, a clean one, something lighter, something not soaked in the weight of the house they came from. I didn't seal it. I just let them rest there. Read now, no longer secrets. That night, I sat on the balcony with a candle flickering beside me. The city murmured below. Somewhere, a couple laughed. A dog barked. The world kept turning, unaware that I had just peeled back years of silence. I thought about sending one of the letters, maybe the one to Lucas. Not for reconciliation, not even for closure, just to release it. But as I held it in my hand, I knew I no longer needed him to understand. The letter had already served its purpose the moment I wrote it. Understanding wasn't the goal, expression was, and I had finally learned how to do that without apology. A few days later, I bought a journal. Not the notebook I scribbled in casually, but a real journal, one with a soft leather cover and thick blank pages that invited permanence. I didn't use it to write about the past. I used it to write about who I was becoming. The first page read, "I am not just what I survived. I am what I chose to become afterward." That became my beginning, a way to mark the shift. From silence to speech, from shadow to shape. Some entries were just a few lines, others, full pages. Some days, I wrote about the way the light moved across the floor. Others, about the strange ache I still felt when I saw a father holding his daughter's hand in the park. The ache didn't mean I was broken. It meant I had once loved deeply and hoped for more, and even if that hope had gone unanswered, it had shaped me into someone who now knew how to care without disappearing. I began writing small notes and hiding them in books I donated to the local library, just a line or two. You're stronger than they told you. This world is better with you in it. Don't wait for them to see you. See yourself. Little whispers for strangers I'd never meet. Maybe someone would find them one day, maybe not. But the act felt healing, like I was planting seeds in places where silence used to grow. And in doing so, I was finally sending the letters that had lived inside me for too long. Not to the past, but forward, to a life that was unfolding slowly, deliberately, and this time, fully mine. I opened the first. It was to my mother. The handwriting was tight, pressed into the paper like I had tried to force the words through it. You told me I was strong, but only when I didn't cry, only when I didn't need anything from you. You said I was good because I didn't ask, so I learned not to ask. I folded the letter again, didn't cry, just breathed. The second was to my father, shorter, sharper. I knew when you were disappointed in me. You didn't have to say it. You just got quieter, and that silence lasted longer than my birthdays. That one stayed in my hand longer. I traced the edge of the paper, remembered the smell of his cologne, the creak of his chair when he leaned back, unread newspaper in hand. He had been a presence more than a person, a mood that filled the room before he entered it. The third letter surprised me. It was to myself, dated 3 years ago. The invitation was simple, a small folded note pressed into my hand after class. Claire didn't say anything when she handed it to me. She just smiled, a warm, quiet smile that didn't expect anything in return, and walked away. I waited until I was home to open it. Inside, in her neat handwriting, were just a few words. Saturday, 3 p.m. My place. We all bring something small. Just stories, nothing formal. Come if you want to. There was no pressure, no RSVP, no address even, just a phone number at the bottom, like she trusted I would ask if I needed it. I held the note for a long time. It had been years since anyone invited me into their home for something that didn't require obligation. Not for caretaking, not for errands, not for managing someone else's emotions. Just presence. The thought stirred something soft inside me, something hesitant. I didn't answer right away. I placed them in a small bowl, wrapped it gently, and stared at my reflection before leaving. My hair was up. My shirt was plain but soft. I looked like myself. A version of myself I didn't yet fully recognize, but one I wasn't ashamed of anymore. Claire lived in an apartment 2 neighborhoods over. The walk was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel like loneliness, but today felt like calm. When she opened the door, I was met with warmth. Not just the kind that comes from lamps and candles, but the kind that lives in the way people speak when they're not performing. There were 5 others in the room, all from the writing workshop, each holding something, a plate of cookies, a folded piece of paper, a notebook clutched tightly like a shield. Their eyes met mine not with curiosity, but with welcome. No one asked why I had come. No one commented on how long I'd been gone from this kind of gathering. They just made room for me on the couch. We didn't start right away. Claire poured tea. Someone passed around homemade muffins. A man named Theo told a story about getting locked out of his apartment in his pajamas. Laughter rippled through the room gently, like wind through leaves. Then Claire looked at me. Not expectantly, not insistently, just invitingly. And I heard myself say, I brought grapes. It was such a small sentence, but it landed in the room like something real. Everyone smiled. I passed the bowl around, and I stayed. I listened more than I spoke, but I did speak. A few sentences, a short reflection about a letter I'd once written and never sent. No names, no pain, just a small truth, spoken into a space that knew how to hold it. Afterward, Claire walked me out. The evening air was cool. A quiet buzz of life drifted in from the nearby street. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. She paused, then added, "You don't have to share anything you don't want to. You don't even have to explain. You can just be here." I nodded. That was the difference, I realized. In my old life, being present had always come with conditions, expectations, performance. Now I was being offered something else entirely, space to just exist, no permission required. On the walk home, I thought about how hard it had been to say yes to something so small, and how much it had meant to me that no one had made a big deal of it. Healing, I was learning, wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looked like sitting on a couch with strangers who didn't feel like strangers, eating grapes, telling stories, being seen without having to bleed. That night, I wrote a new journal entry. Maybe there is no big moment. Maybe healing is a series of invitations, and the quiet courage to accept them. I didn't overthink it. I just let it be what it was. The next week, I saw Claire again in class. She didn't mention Saturday, neither did I. But when I sat beside her, she handed me another folded note. This time, it just said, "Same time next week if you feel like it." I smiled, because I did. I placed the note on the table beside my journal and made tea. I read a few pages of a book I wasn't really following. I watered the plant. I stared at the tiny glowing screen of my phone and told myself it didn't matter either way. But it did. Because saying yes meant admitting that I wanted something more now. Not noise, not drama, just connection. By morning, I had typed the message twice before finally sending it. "Hi, Claire. Thank you for the invitation. I'd love to come." She responded within minutes. "Can't wait to see you. I'll text you the address." Something about the casual tone comforted me. Like I wasn't stepping into anything too big. Like this would just be one more step in a quiet return to myself. That Saturday, I stood in my kitchen, staring at the fruit I had bought. Grapes, safe, simple, easy to share.
It started with music. Not the kind that filled rooms during chores or ran faintly beneath TV dialogue. Not background noise, real music. A song I hadn't heard in years played through the speaker at a corner cafe, and suddenly I was standing there, latte in hand, stunned by the wave of memory that hit me. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even nostalgia. It was joy, pure and unexpected. I walked home humming, and for the first time in a long time, I danced a little. Just a step or two in the kitchen as I reheated soup. No one saw, but I smiled because I realized I hadn't felt light in my body like that in years. There were other things too. Little things. The sound of my own laughter echoing back in my apartment. The way a breeze slipped through the window and fluttered the curtain just enough to make me pause. The taste of something sweet eaten slowly, without rushing, without sharing. I started noticing details I had once overlooked. The way sunlight pooled on my floor in the late afternoon. How the leaves on the tree outside my building shifted color just slightly every week. The comfort of warm socks after a long shower. These weren't grand revelations, but they were mine. And I realized I had missed them. I had missed being present. Not in survival mode, not listening for someone else's need. Just alive, in small ways that didn't ask for anything in return. One morning, I spent an entire hour doing nothing but sipping tea and watching a single bird hop across the fire escape. It made no sense to anyone but me, and that was enough. In the evenings, I took longer walks, sometimes with no destination, sometimes with music, sometimes with silence. I passed strangers and didn't flinch. I caught glimpses of couples and didn't feel envy. I walked with the steady rhythm of someone who was no longer trying to escape anything, only moving forward, slowly, toward herself. There was still sadness, of course. Healing doesn't erase grief. But grief became something I carried in my pocket, not something that consumed my whole chest. I could take it out when I needed to, look at it, fold it back in, and keep going. I reread a few more letters, not to dwell, but to remind myself that I had lived through those moments, that I had made it out, that there was wisdom even in the things I never said. One letter, dated 6 months before my parents passed, ended with the words, "Maybe one day I won't need this paper to speak." I smiled when I read that, because that day had come. I no longer needed paper. I no longer needed permission. At the community gathering, I began sharing more. Not just polished lines, but full truths. One afternoon, I read a short piece about guilt, about the strange, shapeless guilt that comes from not mourning the way others expect you to, about how grief is not always tears. It's silence, or stillness, or relief you're too afraid to name. When I finished, no one clapped. No one needed to. Claire placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and I knew I had been heard. Later that night, I passed by a mirror and stopped, not to check my appearance, but because I saw someone I recognized, someone I had once forgotten. Not the daughter, not the caretaker, not the invisible presence in the background, just me. And I liked her. I liked the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the way her shoulders no longer tensed on instinct, the way she stood still without shrinking. That weekend, I rearranged my apartment, not because I was unhappy with it, but because I wanted to celebrate how I had changed. I moved the bookshelf to the opposite wall, bought new covers for the throw pillows, even painted one corner a deep shade of green. It made the whole place feel warmer, more alive, more mine. In the process, I found an old box tucked under my bed, filled with things I thought I had left behind for good. A few childhood trinkets, a photo of my brother and me, taken years before distance crept between us, a tiny music box that no longer played. I sat with the items for a while, held them gently, let memory pass through me like light through sheer curtains, soft, not blinding. Then I returned them to the box, not to hide them, but to honor them. They were part of me, but not all of me, and they didn't need to take up space on my shelves anymore. That night, I wrote a list in my journal. Things I didn't know I missed. The sound of my own breath, unhurried. Dancing in socks with no audience laughing at nothing. Silence that heals. Saying no without guilt. Saying yes without fear. My name, spoken with care. My own company. The list went on, and when I finished it, I felt something shift. Not a sharp turn, just a slow opening, like a door I didn't realize had been closed for years.
I stepped through it, quietly, intentionally, and I knew, without fanfare or applause, that I was ready to begin again. Not as someone new, but as someone whole. Dear girl I used to be, I see you now. Not just in memory, but in the quiet ways you still echo through my movements. The way I flinch when someone raises their voice, not because I think it's meant for me, but because it once always was. The way I brace for disappointment, even in soft moments. The way I still check the mirror twice, not to admire, but to adjust. You tried so hard, didn't you? To be perfect, to be enough, to disappear just enough to survive. I remember how heavy your silence was, how you held your breath when walking past your parents' bedroom door, hoping not to hear another argument muffled by years of tension. I remember how you learned to read moods like weather, how you shaped yourself like water to fill everyone else's needs. But no one asked you what yours were. Not really. And somewhere along the way, you forgot how to ask yourself. I wish I could reach back and hold your hand, not to change the past, not to warn you, and saying, I see you, I honor you, and I'm sorry it took me this long. You were never weak for wanting more. You were never selfish for needing rest. You were never wrong for dreaming of quiet joy. And now that I have it, this quiet, this softness, this stillness, I carry it not just for me, but for you. I fill my apartment with candles because I know how much you loved the flicker of warmth. I leave the window open at night because I remember how you used to imagine running away with just the stars to guide you. I dance in the kitchen because I know you never got to. I speak out loud when something hurts because you weren't allowed to. You don't have to watch the door anymore. No one is coming to take it all away. You don't have to rehearse your reactions anymore. No one is testing you. You don't have to shrink anymore. No one wins when you disappear. You are no longer surviving. You are living. And the girl I am now is not ashamed of the girl you were. She is proud, grateful, whole because of you. I wish you could see the way the light pours into this room each morning, how the sound of the kettle feels like a beginning, how I write now, not for approval, not for someone else's praise, but because my voice finally feels like it belongs to me. I wish you could feel the peace that comes with solitude that isn't lonely, the kind that feels earned, grown, sacred. But maybe you do. Maybe you're not gone at all. Maybe you're just resting now, somewhere soft inside me, no longer holding the weight, no longer screaming in silence, just watching, quietly, as I finally become the version of us you hoped was possible. I promise to carry you gently. I promise to forgive us for all the times we stayed too long. I promise to love this life we built, not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. And if I ever forget, if the ache ever creeps back in, if the doubt returns in the quiet hours, I'll come back to this letter, to you, to the beginning, with love, me. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel before you go, but just to sit with you, to tell you that the things you feared would destroy you didn't, that you made it through them, and not just as a shell of someone who once dreamed, but as someone who finally gave herself permission to live. You don't have to be ashamed of what you became to survive. You were strong in ways no one ever told you mattered. Strong in staying, strong in holding it together, strong in caring when no one noticed. But now, you get to rest. You get to let go of the script they handed you, the one that said your worth came from being needed, from being quiet, from being small. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to laugh loudly. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to walk into a room and not explain yourself. There was a time when I thought healing meant forgetting you, that I had to shed everything you were to become who I am now. But I was wrong. Healing meant meeting you again, looking you in the eye,